This prisoner's name is really strange. Every time the break hour comes, he secretly approaches the jailer and carefully observes the shape of the keychain hanging on his waist. At night, back in his cell, he sketches the shape of the key. Even if it's just 1 mm off, he patiently redraws it from the start, aiming to create a perfect key replica. At 3 a.m., he secretly lights a match, carefully observes the keyhole on the cell door, then tears a piece of paper and carefully places it over the hole. Soon, he has a rough sketch of the key. Next, he uses a pencil to trace that shape, then takes a roll of paper and slowly feeds it into the keyhole, pressing the bottom with a pencil. After hundreds of thousands of times of rubbing, he calculates the depth of the keyhole. Even though he's perfected it, he's still not happy because the material to make the key is still a problem. So the next day when he went to take a shower, he shared his plan and situation with his cellmate, hoping for help. The cellmate, with his neat long hair, thought for a moment and suddenly came up with a good plan. However, this plan was extremely risky, and to escape, they had no choice but to take the chance. Then, at noon, while working in the workshop, he took advantage of the jailer not paying attention and secretly grabbed some small wooden planks to hide in his thermos bottle, planning to sneak them out. But before he reached the door, disaster struck. Overwhelmed with tension, he couldn't control his expression, and the jailer noticed something. The jailer immediately took his thermos and poured out all the tea inside to check it. He shook it multiple times. Strangely, after checking carefully, he found nothing suspicious and let him go. However, he didn't know that this small mistake would later cause trouble for the prison. After returning to his cell, the prisoner pulled out the hidden wooden planks. The reason he got past the jailer's watch was that he had already thought of a way to deal with it. When the jailer came, his cellmate pretended to spill a box of nails to attract attention, while he secretly stuffed a towel into the thermos. This was how he narrowly escaped. Now everything was ready. He started rubbing the wooden piece continuously, focusing intently, gripping the wood tightly, not missing any details, even the smallest scratches. After filing it, he used sandpaper to smooth it out. Soon, the parts of the key were done. Then, he applied a solution to the joints and carefully assembled the parts. To speed up the hardening process, he even used the heater above to dry it in 2.5 minutes. In the end, he successfully pulled out the wooden key. After confirming that the parts were securely bonded, he checked it against his sketch. The next step, the final one, was filing. After filing it several times, he finally completed the smooth wooden key. He held it nervously and slowly approached the cell door. The sight made him laugh like a blooming chrysanthemum, but the joy didn't last long. Behind this door was another one. But the worst part was that the lock could only be opened from the outside. But by this point, he was determined to finish the second key. In the following days, he took every chance to memorize the keys on the jailer's belt. At night, he sketched it from memory. After a week of effort, he completed the second key. Success. To test its effectiveness, during the daytime labor, he took advantage of the jailer's absence and asked his cellmate to watch. He went to the door, took the key, and tried it in the lock. When it got stuck, he used all the tools he had prepared to file, sharpen, and adjust the key. What excited his cellmate was that after just a few simple adjustments, he successfully opened the steel gate. Amazing! But just as he was about to turn the key back, he was horrified to find the key got stuck inside for no reason. In a moment of panic, a small slip caused the key to break in half. He nearly peed himself at the sight. Just then, his cellmate, returning from the break, rushed to warn him. Everyone quickly returned to work. He frantically tried to fish out the pieces of the broken key with his fingers. Fortunately, in the nick of time, his cellmate quickly grabbed some tools from the workshop. He felt like he had found a lifeline, and immediately tried to pull out the remaining piece of the key. Luckily, just a second before the jailer arrived, he managed to pull out all the wood pieces. Unfortunately, the lock pin was still exposed. After the jailer left, he quickly discarded the mop and ran to the steel gate. He angrily slammed his hand on it, but after hitting it 100,000 times, yet the lock wouldn't budge. In desperation, he resigned himself to fate, lying down on his bed, full of anxious anticipation for what the outcome would be. Clearly indicating that he had narrowly escaped disaster this time. Despite this, his determination to escape was not extinguished. Soon after, he made another key, but now opening the door became a problem. So he and his accomplices discussed a plan. Just then, one of the inmates suddenly came up with a great idea. They could tie a string to both ends of the key, then pass it outside through a gap and manually adjust it so that the key would fit into the lock. However, after hearing this, he shook his head and rejected the idea immediately. At that moment, the jailer unexpectedly came for his patrol. The three of them froze, terrified by the sight, and immediately fell silent, pretending to work. The jailer slammed the steel door open. The air became thick with tension. Luckily, the jailer didn't suspect anything. He glanced around briefly and then walked away. After a while, Leonard walked out of the room, and once he confirmed that the jailer had left, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. While they were still discussing the plan, Stephen suddenly stared at a broom nearby and picked it up to examine it. He stepped out of the room and closed the door. Leonard, from inside, tried the broom. What made them excited was that the broom was just long enough to reach the heart of the lock. The difficulty now was how to use it to turn the key. That day, while working in the workshop, he noticed his cellmate working and took advantage of the machine's movements, carefully shaping a piece of wood. An bold idea flashed in his mind. He prepared a board with a hole, drilled another hole at the broom's handle, and used screws to secure both holes. The key was then attached to another hole. It turned out that he intended to use the principle of a wheel to turn the key. Once everything was ready, they eagerly tried it out in the room. He carefully inserted the key into the lock, adjusted it to the right angle, and with all his strength, turned the pulley. Thanks to their effort, the key turned, and everyone was ecstatic. But before Tim could rejoice, he heard footsteps outside. Tim froze in fear. He quickly tried to remove the key from outside, but worse, in his nervousness, he accidentally dropped the key on the floor. Everything seemed to be falling apart. If the jailer found out the next morning, all their hard work would be in vain. He refused to let this happen. In a moment of desperation, he took a piece of chewing gum that he had been saving and stuffed it into his mouth. Then, he went to the window and, with all his might, tried to extend the broom outside. The gum was placed at the end of the broom. He hoped the gum's stickiness would help keep the key in place. He almost succeeded. But as he carefully pulled back the broom, both the key and the gum fell to the floor at the same time. He was on edge, but now he had to calm down and keep experimenting, as the gum's stickiness only lasted for a short time. He was racing against time. Fortunately, after a few more tries, he finally retrieved the key. After overcoming the danger, he sighed in relief and lay down on his bed. The next day, he shared the good news with his cellmates. All three immediately saw hope. After the successful experience, in the following days, they continued to apply the same method to make keys for the remaining doors. The parts were carefully hidden underground to avoid random inspections from the jailer. After a month passed, they had completed all the keys. The three of them planned to test them out at night. Before acting, they used pillows to create fake dummies. Then, the two of them barefooted slowly went down to the lower level and began testing each key. To escape the prison smoothly, they had to open a total of 15 doors. This time, they made 39 keys because each lock was different, so they had to try them one by one and save time by marking carefully. But after they tried one door, a jailer came out on patrol. The two of them quickly stepped back. At this point, there was no time to go upstairs, so they hid in a storage cupboard downstairs. But the hopeless part was that the cupboard could not be locked from the inside, and the door didn't close properly either. With no other choice, they could only hold on to the bolt. But because the bolt was too short and the contact area was small, they couldn't apply enough force. Soon, it slipped out of their hands. And to make matters worse, the jailer's figure was gradually approaching. Leonard was so terrified that he didn't dare to move. But the jailer certainly didn't expect that two prisoners had escaped and were hiding in the cupboard. As usual, the jailer slowly walked up to the second floor to inspect. Due to a relative oversight, when he entered the room, he didn't realize it was just a mannequin on the bed. He glanced quickly and then left. On the other side, the two prisoners in the cupboard quietly opened the door and carefully moved forward. After confirming that there were no more jailers, they continued testing the keys. Not long after, they finally arrived at the last gate. Unfortunately, before they could finish trying the key, footsteps echoed again from the upper floor. The two of them realized that the jailer must have finished his patrol. Immediately, they quickly locked the steel door and returned to the storage cupboard. Just then, the jailer arrived at the foot of the stairs, and without suspecting anything, he didn't even glance at the cupboard. After the jailer passed by, the two of them quickly climbed to the next floor. He could only endure the fear, disassemble the key parts, and hide them in the water bottle. But the next morning, the jailer aggressively swung open the cell door, entered without a word, and kept his eyes fixed ahead. It turned out that the alarm had been ringing for half an hour, while Tim was still sound asleep in his bed. Only when he was woken up did he hastily stand up to face the jailer's questioning. Tim kept apologizing, but the jailer clearly wasn't a fool. Tim stayed silent. Seeing that he couldn't get anything out of Tim, the jailer ordered a search of the cell. However, after checking the whole room, nothing unusual was found. Just then, the jailer suddenly stopped, turned his head down and saw the broken pieces of the key scattered on the floor. Tim's heart pounded in fear. The jailer picked up one of the broken pieces but, with his basic knowledge, couldn't figure out what it was. At that moment, Tim came up with an idea. He took a photo next to him, shoved it into a gap and forced it to stand upright. Seeing this, the jailer had no choice but to believe him. After yelling at Tim, he left angrily. After this incident, Tim realized that he couldn't delay any longer. The next day, he met with his fellow inmates, preparing to convince them to escape with him. But to his surprise, none of them were willing to go along. It turned out that everyone was scared, and after so many failed escape attempts, they didn't want to face the consequences of being caught again. But freedom was within reach, and Tim and his companions were determined not to give up. They decided to act that very night. Before long, the jailers finished their shifts, and the prison fell silent. Tim began his plan. First, he freed the two of them, then they quickly changed into the civilian clothes they had prepared and jogged to the gate. However, just as they were about to open the door, they suddenly heard a strange noise from downstairs. The three of them slowly let go of the steel door, ready to retreat if necessary. They waited until the noise stopped before continuing with their plan. Quietly, they crept downstairs, planning to hide in the storage cupboard to avoid the first check by the jailer. But once inside, they realized the pins they had prepared had mysteriously disappeared. So he had to squeeze them by hand. They thought it would go smoothly, just like before, but today, the jailer brought a toilet plunger and walked straight toward the storage cupboard. It turned out that the jailer's toilet had suddenly clogged, so he came to the cupboard to find the plunger. But as he stood up, he accidentally dropped the pin from the lock. However, he didn't think much of it, and now he was using the time before the inspection to store the plunger away. Just as he reached the door, the inmate upstairs suddenly screamed loudly. At that moment, the three people in the cupboard could barely stand it any longer, and the cupboard door began to shake. In this tense moment, the jailer finally became irritated by the noise and decided to leave the plunger behind and go upstairs. Finally, the three of them managed to escape. They didn't dare to waste a single moment. As soon as they ran out, they quickly opened each steel door. Not long after, the three of them arrived at the final gate. To their surprise, the outer gate was already open. They hugged each other and celebrated their soon-to-be freedom. Then, the three of them quickly suppressed their joy, put on their shoes, grabbed their jackets and opened the final gate. But as soon as they stepped out, they were horrified to see a jailer on patrol with a gun, standing on the wall. Luckily, they had prepared in advance, using a small mirror to observe the situation. As soon as the guard turned away, they quickly moved towards the gate. The three of them made it to the main gate, then used the same method to get outside. Still, their hearts couldn't stop racing with anxiety, and they kept their heads down, walking quietly forward. It wasn't until two jailers appeared from the opposite direction that they realized their true identities hadn't been discovered. Only then did they finally breathe a sigh of relief. They felt like wild horses that had escaped their reins, galloping freely in the world. Without any obstacles, they made it to the train station, where they immediately hailed a taxi and asked the driver to take them straight to the border. The next morning, as usual, the jailer opened the cell door, woke up the prisoners, and counted them. The only ones who didn't move were Tim and his companions. When the jailer entered the room, he was horrified to discover that Tim wasn't in the bed, only a poorly made dummy. The jailer never imagined that such a large man could disappear without a trace. But by the time he realized, it was too late. The three of them had already boarded the taxi and crossed the border long ago. This story is based on a true event. They were originally political prisoners who opposed racial discrimination and were eventually pardoned in 1991. The film ends here. Remember to subscribe to the channel, like, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the latest films.